we're going to start with some introductions. We're also going to provide some brief updates about kind of how the college application process is shifting a little bit this year due to COVID. So Gladys and I are going to share some updates about that. And then if there are questions, we're happy to answer them. We also have some content prepared that we are happy to share about, approaching the college application process and how to prepare, what you can be doing this summer if you're a student. So we're going to go ahead and get started. My name's Gracie Francisco. I'm a program manager, obviously with 10,000 degrees. I just started my 6th year as a staff member, and I've actually been with 10,000 degrees as a student since 2011. And so I received a scholarship from 10,000 degrees when I found out when I was a high school senior. I went to college at UC Santa Cruz, and I studied history. I got my bachelor's degree in history, and then I started in the fellowship program with 10,000 degrees right after I graduated from college, and I've been here ever since. In the time that I have worked with 10,000 degrees, I've worked with both our Central Marin and our North Marin region, so that's San Rafael City Schools as well as Novato Unified. And right now in my current role, I'm focused on supporting our middle schools and high schools in Novato Unified. Did I miss anything, Gladys? Is that comprehensive enough? Okay, cool.
Hello, everyone. My name is Gladys Fajardo. I am also a program manager at 10,000 Degrees, and I specifically work with the students in the Petaluma region. Like Gracie, I was also a part of 10,000 Degrees as a student. I started my journey with 10,000 Degrees as a sophomore in 2010, high school sophomore in 2010. I went through the summer intensive program and then was supported with a scholarship all through my college journey. My journey actually started at College of Marin after graduating from Novato High School. And then I transferred to UC Berkeley, where I studied cognitive science and ended up deciding to also minor in education, partly because of my involvement with 10,000 Degrees. Through college, I was also able to stay connected with the organization as a student advisor over our summer programs. And it's one of the reasons why I decided to come back and continue to do the work that we do at 10,000 Degrees, which is supporting students from low-income backgrounds. And it's the reason I continue to be here. Anything else I missed? I think, okay.
We're good. So I know there's still some participants that are trickling in. I recognize a lot of names on there as some of our new students, so we're really excited to have you. This is a little preview of some of the information you'll be getting at the Summer Intensive next week, but this is also kind of a broader focus on how things have shifted due to COVID and how we're going to be supporting students, and we'll share some resources as well. So if you do have questions for us just in general or in response to anything that we share, you can go ahead and use the Q&A function. You can just type in your question and then Gladys and I will take turns answering questions live here. Obviously, if we don't go as in depth as you need or you want to talk about a more personal situation, you're absolutely welcome to reach out to either one of us or any of our managers or fellows that work in the Institute or in the Access program. So don't be shy. We love questions. And one of the things that we're going to start by talking about are kind of the changes around the testing expectations for rising seniors. So as you all know, we've been at home since March, and that has definitely made things difficult in terms of accessing testing. Obviously, we're not going to send hundreds of students to testing centers to take the SAT and the ACT because right now it's not safe. And so a lot of school systems have come out and said, we want to recognize that this is a challenge for people, and so we're actually going to be test optional this year. And so there's a little bit of, I think, confusion because a lot of students are saying, well, what does test optional really mean? And is it going to hurt me if I don't take the tests? Like if students who do wind up taking the test, are they going to look better than I am in terms of where I am as an applicant? And it's a little bit unclear, right? We're all in this together for the first time. But what we have sort of come to recognize is especially if you have a fee waiver to take the test, like if you've gotten a fee waiver from your guidance counselor at school or from a program like 10,000 Degrees, and you are able to safely take the test, there's no harm in taking it, right? So if you're able to, if it feels safe, if there's a testing center that's close to you that is open, then by all means take the test. But we don't want the SAT and ACT testing to be adding additional stress or pressure, especially during this time. So if you have questions about, like if you haven't taken it yet and you're stressed out about that, come talk to one of us and we can kind of advise you what is best for your situation. But the other thing that we want to make really clear is, the UC system and the CSU system, which are, two of the systems that we work most intimately with, they have both systems have come forward and said that their schools are going to be test optional. But if you are planning on applying to schools out of state or you're looking at private schools, you need to do some additional research and look at the individual schools that you're applying to see what their policies are around being test optional. I've looked into some private schools and out of state schools, and it does seem like most schools are on board with this, but there might be things in the fine print that make it a little bit different institution by institution. So if you're confused about wording or you're not certain what something means, just come ask us or send us a screenshot of their policy and say, like, what does this mean? And we'd be happy to answer those questions for you. Gladys, do you want to add anything else about testing before I talk about the credit, no credit from this past semester?
I'll cover a little bit about the CSU or the CSU requirements, but for the CSU specifically, what they mean by test optional is that they will not use this test. If you take it, they will not use it to analyze whether you will be admitted or not, but they can use it to place you in an English and math class or to meet a specific requirement for your A through J's. Like
yeah. So the idea is that if you take the test, it can't hurt you in the application process. It can only help you. Ideally, that's what they're telling us. And again, like this is the first time we've experienced this, and so we're not exactly sure how it's going to play out, but that's what their position has been thus far. And of course, if there are updates, we'd be happy to update. So the other thing that we wanted to touch base about is credit, no credit, right? So a lot of you, I'm looking at the list of participants and I see, students from a lot of our various schools, and you were probably sent home from school in the middle of March, and depending on where you go to school, your district or your individual school itself has probably approached this differently. So I can speak to what I know best, which is Nevada Unified School District. And essentially what they did was they sent students home to do distance learning on the computer. And basically your grade after March 13th, I believe, basically it could only go up. So if you went home and you did a rock star job of being online, it was easy for you, and you improved your grades, that's great. Then your grades would have gone up. But if you had a hard time, which I think was probably a more common experience, and your grade dropped a little bit, it actually, what was reflected in your final grade for the semester should not be below where you were on March 13th. So again, if you have questions about that, or you're looking at your transcript and you're confused, come talk to us or reach out to your guidance counselor. But that's kind of where we're at in terms of the credit, no credit. And then in terms of what that means for the college application process, again, the CSU and UC system have come out and said, we'll take the credit, no credit grades for this past semester. So if you, if you have credit only for all of your classes, then as long as that they're looking at that as a passing grade for this semester in particular. Now, like I mentioned earlier, each school district approached this differently. So I know some school districts, including Nevada, gave students the opportunity to decide whether or not they wanted to receive credit, no credit, or whether or not they wanted to receive grades. So you had to pick, like, do you want all letter grades or do you want credit, no credit for all of your courses? And if you have your regular letter grades, it's business as usual, right? So C or better is going to qualify, or that meets the A through G requirement, but it's different for every school. So your 10,000 Degrees fellows and managers are familiar with the policies that their schools and districts have put forward. So if you don't go to Novato or one of the schools in Novato, then you can check in with Gladys about schools in Petaluma, or Liz about the schools in North Sonoma. We'll be happy to figure that out for you. Gladys.
Now, the updates from the CSUs pretty much cover everything that Gracie just covered. They are utilizing that grading technique, and also or review transcripts, and also the SAT and ACT testing. In addition to that, they've also announced that the GPA minimum has increased. To be eligible to apply to the CSUs, you have to have a 2.5 or above, which is different from what they've done previous years, which is a 2.0. But just remember, this is only for this academic year. So if you're applying in the fall, winter, or spring, you will be required to have a 2.5 or above. Students who have a 2.0, between a 2.0 and a 2.49 are still really encouraged to apply, because what is going to happen is that they're going to build into the application different ways to ask for the colleges to ask questions that give them more of a holistic view about you. So that can include a household income, extracurricular activities, how many courses over the requirement you completed for A through Gs. But it's really up to the campus what type of questions they want to ask, and how they're going to determine whether those students that are between the 2.0 and the 2.49 are whether they're eligible to go into the CSU, into their specific CSU. So even if you still have, again, below a 2.5, we highly, and above a 2.0, we highly still encourage you to apply, because we don't know what those other aspects are going to be yet, but we're expecting them to be things that you'll be able to fulfill.
One other thing I wanted to share too in terms of updates is at the end of this past semester, from our current group of seniors, we got a lot of questions about housing. Like, what is housing going to look like? Are we still going to have to pay for it? And I think that is being addressed more on a school by school basis. And when our incoming seniors get to this point next year, we kind of, we don't really know where we're going to be at. So, we still want you to look at all of those options, consider all of your options. And we're going to be adjusting our curriculum in the in the access programming to address all of this, but that's just something to keep in mind. If you know any seniors too who are confused about that, they don't have to be in 10,000 Degrees. You're welcome to refer them to us, and we're happy to answer any questions. We know that it's it can be confusing, so I just wanted to put that out there as well. And I also wanted to, I know we keep having people pop in, which is wonderful. We're super excited that you're here. I mentioned at the beginning, but this is being recorded, just so you know. So if you missed our introductions at all, or you missed any of the information, you can always go back and watch it on our YouTube channel once the live is done. And if you have questions, you can type them into the question box and we will answer them.
So I actually do have a question, Gracie, that's kind of in what you shared. The question is, will colleges look at your GPA from the past semester, so spring 2020, if you did letter grades, as seriously as they would used to? Or will they be a little bit more lenient?
That is a wonderful question, Olivia. Thank you for asking that question. And, I hate having to say this over and over again, but it's kind of, we're not sure, right? Because this is kind of new. I think one thing that's really important to recognize, no matter what, COVID or not, is that if you apply to a school and, you get rejected, or they send you a letter of denial, and you feel strongly that you have information to share with the school that was not reflected in your application, or there were substantial challenges behind the scenes, that you can absolutely send a letter to the admissions office and say, hey, I want you to have this information. I want this to be included in your decision, or like as you make a decision about me as an applicant to your campus. Gladys, do you want to add to that?
I think you covered it. Yeah. Any other questions?
We have some
Again,
other topics we can chat about if you're still thinking of questions or you're not sure yet. We have another question in the chat box. Can a good SAT test make up for a low GPA? So I wouldn't necessarily make up for, but I think what's important to recognize is that it can't hurt you, right? So let's say that your GPA is a little bit lower, but you take the SAT or the ACT, or you're able to take the SAT or the ACT, and you perform really well in certain sections. They're absolutely going to take that into account. And part of the reason that the campuses still look at, testing as part of your application is because they want to get a little bit more of a holistic picture of you. So personally, do I think the SAT and the ACT are the best way to do that? Not really, but that's a whole different topic. We can talk about testing in a whole different live session. But they are going to look at your GPA. They're going to look at your test scores. If you're applying to a campus that requires writing, they will absolutely look at your writing. In fact, I would say your GPA is absolutely important, as are your test scores if you're able to submit them, and your AP scores too. But writing is so, so important. Like if you're going to give your attention to anything, especially over the summer, I would say work on your writing, start working on your writing. Like I have had students in the past who have reworked drafts of their essays like 15 times, and it's not like a full rewrite every time, but they're making tweaks, revisiting, having other folks look at it if they feel comfortable with that. So I would say definitely put your energy into the writing process rather than worrying about the testing.
looks like we have another question from Stephanie. It says, can you tell us a little bit about what your college application process was like and what made getting through it easier? I can answer that first. So my college application, thankfully I was able to get help from 10,000 Degrees to guide me through the process. I'm a first generation college student, so my brother was actually the first one to go through the college process himself. And at the time, I was an undocumented student, so my process looked a little different than it does for students who are undocumented now. But what helped me get through it was 10,000 Degrees. But I think it could be just having support in general. I think that's part of why we talk about being first generation, is because students who have the privilege of having a parent or a grandparent that went to college, they have that person there that helps them through the process. Even if they went through it 20 years ago, they know some portions of the application process. So for me, having someone on a weekly basis that told me what I needed to get done that week, especially as a high school senior where my organizational skills weren't the best yet, and having someone that I could go to ask any question that I had about the process was made a huge difference. What about you, Gracie?
Yeah, absolutely echoing what Gladys said. I think, when I was a high school student, I felt like I was kind of out of the loop, and I actually I didn't visit any college campuses until I think the first time was October of my senior year. So I was a little behind. And when I was in high school, they weren't doing virtual tours and stuff like that yet on the internet. And so yeah, the first time my dad took me to visit a college campus that I was thinking about applying to was in October of my senior year. I hadn't taken the SAT at that point. I remember that being really, really stressful. But I didn't know, if you don't know you don't know what you don't know. So once I figured it out, I was like, okay, I have some work to do in front of me. But I felt really lost during the college application process. And at the time, 10,000 Degrees wasn't in my life. I applied, I applied to the scholarship for 10,000 Degrees on March 2nd, which is the day that it's due, because my mom happened to see an advertisement for it on the bulletin board where she worked. She worked at a retirement facility. So I feel like there was like some divine intervention there with 10 Katie coming into my life. But I will say, reflecting back, one of the pieces that I think stands out most for me is the writing process. And I was taking an AP class during my senior year, and for a lot of AP classes, they have summer assignments. And so one of our summer assignments was actually to work on the college essays. And at the time, the personal statement for the UC system was a little bit different. So it was actually only two essays instead of the personal insight questions. And I remember that being a really actually difficult process for me, because I wasn't expecting the writing process to be as personal as it was, which is silly because it's called a personal statement. But I really started to reflect on things that had happened in my life, and, what did I want to share with these people? And so I think that's also why it's so important to give yourself time in the writing process, because, it brings up a lot of emotions, and sometimes we need help processing that, and it takes time. So that's what stood out most for me. I wound up writing my personal statement about my experience being the sibling of somebody who has special needs, and how my relationship with my brother really informed what I wanted to do when I grew up, and who I wanted to be in the world. But it was very personal. So I would say the college application process for me was, it's difficult. It's hard to navigate. And that's a huge reason why I came back to work for 10,000 Degrees, was because I wanted to make sure that, if I had information that could be helpful to other students, that I was in a place that I could share that, like Gladys said. So yeah, great question, Stephanie.
I think another thing that comes up for me with that question is how much easier it was to get through it emotionally, because I had peers around me that were going through the same thing. So one thing that I would tell students now is finding at least one other person. It doesn't have to be your best friend. It could just be a classmate that's going through the same process as you, because it's really helpful to have people to remind you of deadlines, to peer review your essays, like Gracie said, or that could even be an adult. It could be your college and career center specialist, letting them know that you're going through the process. It could be your high school counselor. 10,000 Degrees. We're at different campuses throughout Marin and Sonoma, and even some in San Francisco in the East Bay. So if there's someone from 10,000 Degrees, if we don't only help the students that are in our caseloads, if you come in to help, to ask for help, or if you send us an email now that we're remote, you can also get some support from an adult.
Yeah, and I think something else to add to that too is I was reminded of this because I'm looking at the attendee list again, and I see some of my former students on here, which is really cool. But there are thousands of students in 10,000 Degrees who have gone through this process before you. And so if you're a rising high school senior, or you're a junior and you're preparing for this process, and you'd like some mentorship or connection from an older student who's done this already, please reach out to us. We're happy to connect you to our students who've done this before, and they have great insight about what this experience is like for them, and they've gone through it a lot more recently than Gladys and I have. Yeah. All right. Any other questions? We have some other content that we can cover if there are not other questions, but we really want to make sure that you all have an opportunity to engage with us while we're here live. Okay, maybe what we'll do is talk a little bit more about some of the ways that you can be preparing, and if questions come up for you, feel free to add them to the chat box. Gladys, do you want to talk about letters of recommendation?
Yes. So I love talking about letters of recommendation because as a high school student, and even during college, I was really shy. So it was challenging for me to really develop that relationship with my teachers, until I realized that I really had to, for them to be able to get to know me at a level where they could write a letter of recommendation for me. So whether it is for a scholarship or for, usually is private schools that request letters of recommendations, the CSUs and UCs usually don't, unless you're applying to EOP for the CSU campuses. So having at least 2 to 3 staff members or people in your life that you could lean on and ask for a letter of recommendation, I would recommend to, if you don't already know who those people would be, to start thinking about who you could reach out to, who knows you well, not only academically, but also as a student, as a maybe they know a little bit about what your life story has been. And if they don't yet, you still have the chance if you're right now a junior, a freshman, sophomore, junior, and even if you're coming into senior year, you still have some time to develop that relationship during your fall semester. But if you are an incoming senior, make sure that you do that as soon as the school year starts. If you feel like those relationships aren't developed as much as you would like to. One thing that we also usually recommend is to give your teachers or community member that you're connecting with at least 2 weeks, the least, to write a letter of recommendation. Usually a month is best, just because if they're a teacher, they're going to have other students asking for letters of recommendation. If they're at 10,000 degree staff, they might have other students asking for letter of recommendation. And also coming and asking with what we call the brag sheet. And a brag sheet usually includes things that you've been involved in during high school, whether it's sports, clubs, if you've had a job, your maybe favorite class, or the reason you want to study a specific subject. Anything else that you would include in a brag sheet, Gracie?
No, I think it's just important that to remember that your brag sheet, or whatever you want to call it, it's kind of like a resume almost. It gives your teacher or your coach or your advisor, whoever, a little bit more of an insight into who you are as a person, right? Because even your relationship with your teacher, they might know you well, but they know you in the context of being a student in their classroom, and you're so much more than that, right? So these brag sheets or resumes are really helpful to provide some more context to the people that are writing letters about you. Also, we have another question from Marcia. Hi, Marcia. Thank you for joining us. How are you responding to questions about whether or not to take a gap year or just take a year to work, and the impacts of that decision? That is a fantastic question. So we have seen from this past senior class, I can actually only think of 2 students that were entertaining the idea of a gap year, and actually both decided that they were just going to take some courses through the community college instead. So it really depends. Every student is different. Every situation is different. Everybody's financial situation is different. It really, really depends on the situation that you are in. But I would say if this is something that you're considering, don't make that decision on your own. Make sure that you're reaching out for help, and you're really thinking about what and I don't know, not necessarily pros and cons, but what are the benefits of taking a gap year? What are the benefits now? What are the benefits down the road? But also, what are some of the potential challenges, right? So sometimes taking a gap year, it can make it more difficult to enroll the next year because you don't feel as connected to the people that were supporting you previously, or you're not sure who to ask your questions to, things like that. So if that's something that you're entertaining, it's definitely a decision that you want to make really mindfully and with support. Do you want to add to that, Gladys?
Yeah, I think one of the important things about taking a gap year is to be really intentional about why you're taking the gap year. Is it because you're going to do a different program? Is it because you're maybe thinking of taking community college classes? Because if you do, there's always a confusion of oh, I'm just going to go take a gap year, maybe take a few community college classes. But once you make that decision, you're actually not considered as taking a gap year anymore. You're actually being considered as being a transfer student at that point. So making sure you plan for what that year is going to look like for you, because the schools are going to want to know what you did with your time and why.
And then in terms of our colleges saying anything to students about it, I haven't heard a whole lot in conversation. I know one thing that was brought up in a meeting I was in a couple weeks ago was, students who are currently in college were thinking about taking some time off because they were like, well, why am I paying all of this money to take classes online, which I think is a totally valid question and a really important one, because as we know, the cost of college is incredible. It's huge. And for, some students, being in an online classroom works. And for some majors, that's easier than others. But for, a good number of students, it's not how they learn. And so I have heard from a couple students that they're thinking about potentially taking like a leave of absence for a semester while some of the COVID stuff gets sorted out, and taking classes at the community college instead. So again, it's a really individual decision, and the student needs to, talk to their advisors both at their college campus. They can check in with us if they want to, check in with their guidance counselors, but I haven't heard so far about college campuses saying much about it. I would say NCAN, National College Attainment Network. I think they just changed their branding. I'm still learning. They might have some valuable resources to check out, Marcia, if you want more information about that. Did that answer the question? I hope so. It's weird not being able to see everyone's faces. I feel like I'm just talking to Gladys. Alrighty. Another thing that we wanted to check in about is college lists and virtual touring, right? So unlike when I was in high school, virtual college tours are a lot more accessible and available. So a lot of campuses have on their websites like video tours. Some of them are very creative. I've seen some that like use drones and all kinds of stuff to like show off the campus. They take you into the dorms so you can really see. And so one of the things that we're going to have our next group of institute students working on next week, preview, is doing some virtual tours. And so we've actually put together a list of some campuses that have pretty great virtual tours available, and we'll share that on our website after this webinar as well. But that's a really easy and affordable way to at least get an idea of what a campus looks like, especially if it's a campus that's further away. Going on college tours and looking at campuses can be really expensive depending on where they are. If you're looking out of state or you're looking in Southern California or wherever, it can be expensive, and especially right now, it's really not the safest decision. So we're highly encouraging the use of virtual tours, and then also using that information to kind of help build your college list. So I remember when I first went to look at a specific campus that I was interested in, I was so excited about it. I was like, this is great. I've like done all, I've seen they have this major that I'm interested in, and I was super excited to see it. And then I got to campus and I was like, this is not what I was anticipating. And I really didn't see myself being happy there. And so I wound up taking that, I wound up actually not even applying to that school. So what we encourage students to do when building a college list, especially if you're looking at, like, let's say you're looking at multiple 4 years, or even with the community colleges, like, in where we are, we have 2 really fantastic community colleges pretty much right in our backyard, College of Marin and SRJC. And there are certain programs at one one school and certain programs at another. So it's really important just to compare your options. But when you're building a college list, it's better to start big and narrow it down. So if you have any interest in a school, whether it's the location, a major that they have, like, start big. Sometimes students start with like 20 schools on their list. And then, you start doing the research and you can sort of start narrowing it down. So what we recommend is that a student chooses 3 safety schools. So these are schools that like you are guaranteed to get into. So that's going to be different for every student, but an example that I like to use is the community colleges, right? They have 100% acceptance rate. So no matter your GPA, no matter where you went to high school, you can put a community college on your safety list. And then you have your target schools. So those are schools where you meet the majority of the requirements. You're maybe right on par with other students who applied before you. And like that could be with test scores, GPA. It doesn't have to be an exact match, but it needs to be pretty close. And then reach schools are schools where, you'd really like to check out that campus, or there's something really intriguing to you about that campus, but maybe your GPA is a little bit on the lower side of what they accept. Or, I don't know, maybe you feel like, yeah, that's like probably the best example that I can think of is like GPA, or maybe your test scores are a little bit lower, but that's not even really relevant right now with test optional. So those are kind of the three categories: safety, target, and reach. Um, and then really briefly, I feel like I've been talking a lot, but really briefly, I want to say something about dream schools, and the concept of dream schools. I think that this is something that our society really pushes, and kind of, you know, we talk about like, oh, you know, what's your dream school? Where do you want to go? Like, if you could see yourself anywhere, where would it be? And I think that language can be a little bit, it can be harmful actually in some ways, because what if you don't get into that school, like, and your sights have been set on that school? You know, what I like to remind students is that there are thousands of colleges just in the US. There are hundreds here in California alone, and each of us is different. And so there are going to be things, for example, when I was deciding where to go to school, I was deciding between Berkeley and Santa Cruz. And I went to Berkeley and I didn't feel at home there. Obviously, Gladys had a different experience because Gladys went to Berkeley. And people looked at me like I was crazy when I said that I was choosing Santa Cruz over Berkeley. But I was really thought about it, and I was like, you know what, if I am feeling stressed out and you know, I'm under a lot of pressure, I want to be in a place that feels serene to me, where I can go for a hike in the forest or go down to the beach to kind of unwind. Like, those things were really important. And ultimately, I wound up being really, really happy at Santa Cruz. And I think that was the decision that was best for me. But it's going to be different for every student. So I would just say that when we're thinking about dream schools, I would be careful of that narrative and perpetuating that narrative. Gladys, you want to take the next question?
Sure. So the next question is, what do admissions people look for in a college essay, and has this changed because of COVID-19? So usually what colleges look for in an essay is that the student's authentic voice comes through. So they don't always look for a sob story. I feel like that's one of the biggest misconceptions. Like, you just have to tell everything about yourself that you've struggled through, which can be really traumatic for the student writing it. I think as long as you're answering the prompt, but you're also sharing, like, either way, you have to open up. It's when you're writing a personal statement, you have to share things that you usually wouldn't share on a day-to-day. And so yes, it's gonna be challenging to write. I'm sorry, I'm like thinking of my challenges that I had with the writing process. Just to give you a little backstory, when I applied as a high school senior, I was not happy with my essays. When I wrote my essays, I felt like my story had been told 1,000 times, and I didn't feel special at all, because I was just one other undocumented student applying to schools and so I didn't tell that story. I instead decided to tell a different story, and that's a choice that you make. But because of that, my authentic self, I wasn't showing a whole picture of myself when I applied as a senior. When I applied as a transfer student, I made a different decision and decided to share information that I usually wouldn't, because I knew that they needed to see what my life was like, and that's what they wanted to see. And keeping that specific portion of myself the first time around didn't allow me to tell my full story. And that's what I mean by letting your voice come through. What about you, Gracie?
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good point. Like, with writing the essays, being authentic is the most important thing. So I know there have been certain essays, like in the last couple of years, that have like made it to the New York Times because people were so inspired about it. There was one really big one a couple of years ago about a student who had written about her experience at Costco, and you know, so it doesn't have to be this like profound moment in your life. I think as long as you can provide context to explain why that was significant, if that's what's really important. Like, you want to show, you know, I think this is why peer editing can be helpful, or having somebody else look at your essays, maybe not a peer, but it could be a peer or an adult that you trust, because you're looking at your own experience through this very zoomed in lens, right? But let's say Gladys or I have the privilege of reading your essay, and we get to read it, and we've been working with you for X number of months, and we can say, well, we've also talked about this, or you've shared with me about this. Is there some extra context that you can provide to give this person a bigger picture of who you are? So I think that piece is really important. And I think also making sure that when you're writing, that you are focusing on your experience. So one thing that I see that's very common is we have a lot of students that write about their parents and the challenges that their parents have experienced in order to pave the way for them to be able to have the opportunities that they do. I love hearing students share about that, but the essay is not about, it shouldn't be about your parents. It needs to be about your experience with your parents, and how did the choices that your parents made or the sacrifices that they made, what impact did those have on you, and how do you feel about it? Because that's what our the people reading your essays really want to see. So that's something else I think to keep in mind. And in terms of, has it changed because of COVID? I don't think so. I think it's still pretty much the same, that you want to be your authentic self and provide that bigger picture information. So Elena had a couple other questions. Are there advantages to applying early decision or early action? Gladys, do you want to answer that?
Are there advantages to applying early decision, early action?
It's kind of a whole topic in itself.
Like, where do I start?
Yeah.
Do you want
Yeah,
to
I can share a little bit. I think that's a complex question, which I appreciate. But I think, again, it depends on the student. I should get a t-shirt made that says it depends on the student. It's a very individualized experience. So, if you have a student who, there's a really specific major that they're interested in at a specific school, right? And they know that they want to study that. They've done like internships in high school that have, they've had experience with that and they're like really set on it, then yeah, absolutely. I think one of the advantages is like you just find out sooner, right? And so it's like you're not stressed out about making that decision. But I personally feel like it can be a little bit limiting. And so again, it really just depends on who you talk to. And if you have questions, like if you individually as a student or a parent have questions about that, I would encourage you to have a more individualized conversation where we can kind of talk about the benefits and challenges for your specific situation. Does that sound adequate, Gladys, or what do you think? Yeah.
Yeah, I think the one thing that you need to really watch out for, like you said, Gracie, is because some of these are binding, meaning that once you apply, if you do get in, you are expected to attend that school. It is limiting. So just making sure you really understand the rules around what applying early action, early decision for schools.
Yeah.
And usually these are primarily for private schools.
Primarily, yeah. The UCs and CSUs don't do early decision.
Which kind of leads to the next question.
That's good. Do you want to read it?
Yeah. The next question is, can you explain what the common application is? So we usually talk a lot about the CSU system, the UC system, but there's also applications for the private schools. And one way that private schools have kind of built this way to have a centralized way to apply, just like the CSUs and UCs, is through the Common App. Not all private schools have their application on the Common App. So you have to be, again, really diligent when you're applying to private schools to see which way they offer for students to apply. Sometimes they only offer Common App, sometimes they only offer their own application, sometimes they offer both and you can choose. So really doing your research and making the choice of which one you want to do. One of the benefits of the Common App is that you can fill one, it has common questions that you can use. So you can use it for multiple schools instead of rewriting it over and over again. Yeah. But there is a cost, there's a fee to applying, it's not free. But again, you can also get fee waivers from the school. You just have to, again, be more diligent reaching out to the schools to ask for those fee waivers.
Yeah, one thing I think that's really important that if you haven't picked up on this yet, you have to be organized during the college application process. And I know for me, like when I was a high school senior, that was not my forte. I think Gladys mentioned that too. Things have definitely changed because I think Gladys is the most organized person that I know. So it takes practice, right? It's not like, sometimes we're like naturally organized, but it also, you have to do it over and over and again for it to kind of become more common practice. So one thing that we encourage students to do is to make a document that's like a, username and password tracker. You can also keep track of like where you're at in your application process. What are your deadlines? You can organize by like when are things due. It's really, really helpful. So we actually have a document that again, we can post and share that one of our fellows created, Katya, created this a couple years ago. And I myself actually use it just for like personal, like, keeping track of like my usernames and passwords for various accounts. So I think that's also a really helpful thing to mention, especially since we're talking about all these different portals and things that you have to keep track of. Another question from Elena. Thank you for asking all of these awesome questions, Elena. Do I need to choose a major? Short answer is no. It depends on your school again, but you can, for most schools, you can go in undecided. I went in, I think I went in as a, you know what, I can't remember. I wound up being a history major, but I think I actually went in undecided because when I was first going to school, I was really interested in nursing. While I was in college, I actually worked in the emergency room. And so I wanted to be in medicine. I'm not a huge math and science person, but I really enjoy the aspect of caring for others, and so that's why I was interested in it. So you can go in with a certain major, you can go in undecided, you can change your majors once you're already in school. I have friends who changed majors like 3 or 4 times, and some, they were like, I don't know if I want to major in this, so I'm going to have it as a minor instead, which just means you have to take fewer classes in that subject area. So you can definitely change. The one thing I will say about that is if you know for certain that you want to do something like engineering, right, or even nursing or some of these more competitive fields, it's more difficult to change. So if you have a strong idea of what you're interested in, go in with that. And then if you are really dissatisfied, you can always change it once you get there. But if making that decision is paralyzing for you and it's scary, you can go in undecided. It just might be more difficult. Like some schools have a hard rule where like, if you want to do engineering, you have to go in as an engineering major because there's so many courses required and they need to get you out in a certain amount of time. But it really depends on the school. You want to add to that, Gladys?
Yeah, I think one thing to ease your mind if you haven't decided what you're gonna want to major in is that schools expect your first 2 years to be about exploring the different majors, even if it's, for example, in the department that we call letters and sciences, which is all the social sciences like sociology, psychology, and many, many more. That's why they ask you to take what they call your general requirements the first 2 years, which is your basic English and math and different requirements about in different fields, because they know that you're just starting that exploration process. So don't feel pressure to just choose something because it's on the application.
Yeah. Yeah. And then one other thing I would say too, and I'm glad that Gladys mentioned this, is the first 2 years are for exploration, right? And I think that's one of the huge benefits of community college. I didn't start at community college. I've taken classes there, but I was really determined to get out of the house when I was 18. But looking back, and we didn't really touch on this, there's gonna be a whole nother week around financial aid, but looking back, if I could have done one thing differently in my college process, I would have started at community college if I knew then what I know now, because I didn't go to college for free. I had to take out a pretty significant amount of money in loans in order to make college an option for me. And I'm okay with that because I wouldn't have been able to do it otherwise. at least at the four-year school. But if I had known how much money I could have saved by starting at the community college, and you know, I could have had a little bit more flexibility in exploring what I was interested in and not feeling so like pressured to make a decision because I was at this really expensive school, I think I would have done that differently. So we're all about the community colleges. We have great support systems at our local community colleges to make sure that our students have the resources that they need to get through. So that's something else to think about. We have about 9 minutes left. We have one more question here that we can answer. And if you have any final questions, make sure you throw them in the chat box before we wrap up. Do you want to take this question, Gladys?
Sure. All right. So the last question is, any final tips on how to make my college application stand out? So one thing that I learned specifically from a UC Berkeley rep that helped me fill out my application is the recommendation was don't leave anything blank. Even if you feel like you don't have that specific extracurricular activity that they're asking for, sometimes what it is just that you did do it. It's just that you don't think that that's worth putting into the application. But anything as little as you feel it is, it's not little to them. So again, make sure you try to leave the least amount of things you leave blank, the best.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a really good tip. Gladys and I actually went to a conference earlier this last school year in the fall with UC Berkeley, and it was so enlightening just to kind of see sort of the behind the scenes on the application. But that was one of the big things that they recommended was like, you know, for the UC application in particular, there's 8 personal insight questions that you get to choose from, and you have to pick 4. But then there's a whole section at the end that says like any additional, you know, anything else you want us to know. And they told us like you can put another personal insight question into that box. So if there's space on the application, use it. I think that's one big thing to make your application stand out. It also, you know, gives the impression that you're really thorough. So I think that's important. And then, you know, we already sort of alluded to this, but I think one of the really big things is you have to be authentic. I didn't realize like how important that was when I was going through the process, but now as somebody who has the privilege of supporting students through the process, you know, we can tell when you're using your voice or when somebody else's voice is showing up. And so, you know, like if you're editing your essays and you're getting all this feedback from people and they're changing your words and moving things around, like, you know, you don't have to be perfect. There's no such thing as perfection. And it is so much more compelling to me when I read a college essay and I can tell, like I can hear my student's voice in my head when I'm reading it. That is so much more powerful to me than, you know, something that's been over edited and filled in by lots of people. So be yourself. I think that's the biggest thing. What do you think, Gladys?
And essays, like really, that's where your voice is going to come through if you really spend that time, like Gracie mentioned earlier, working on it and not just waiting before the deadline the day before or even a week before. Like really spend the time this summer on revising those essays. And remember that it's not only the essays for the colleges, you're also going to want to start looking into scholarships and they're going to want essays. So
Everything's available, like the personal insight questions, you can Google it, they're up. Common app questions are out. Like you can start working on this right now. In fact, if you're going to be at the summer intensive next week, you will be working on it. Also, I encourage all of you to submit a 10,000 Degrees scholarship, and you're going to need an essay for that. So there's definitely writing to be done regardless of where you're starting in your college journey. And I would argue, I mean, to give an example of you know, why I think writing is so important. A couple of years ago, I had 2 students, both applied to UC Santa Cruz. Both were great students, had worked really, really hard. One of them had a 3.7 GPA for applying, and one had a 4.1 GPA. the student who had a 3.7 spent a lot of time on her writing, a lot of time. She did lots of drafts. She spent, she spent a lot of time like being intentional about how she was putting herself out there. And the other student had a lot going on during her senior year with sports and working and all kinds of stuff. And she wasn't able to put as much time into it. She wound up getting into some amazing schools, but the student who had the 3.7 was actually the student that got into Santa Cruz and is there today. The other student is at another UC and doing totally well. But I think that's something to kind of give you a little bit more detail as to why we emphasize the writing process so much. Alrighty. Any final questions before we close out? Gladys, do you want to end with any like tips or?
Kind of reminder that if you haven't had a chance to watch our video series on the college application process, it's called Roadmap to College. It's on our website, so we highly encourage you to take a look at that. We talk in depth, way more in depth about the things that we covered today, and also give you some resources on how to, what websites to use to build your college list.
Yeah.
And in 2 weeks, we'll be hosting, our team will be hosting one about financial aid. So in your calendar, put it in your calendars, in 2 weeks from today, there will be more about financial aid.
My favorite part of my entire job is the financial aid process. I'm not doing that webinar. Rondell and Liz will be doing that. We also have content that's being put out by other folks from our programs team. So people who work with our current college students in various regions. They're going to be doing some other really great content over the next couple of weeks. So this time on Wednesdays is a great time to just pop in and get some extra support and get your questions answered. But definitely a plug for the financial aid one, because I know a lot of students have questions about financial aid. Alrighty, we are just about done. Oh, I think there might be one more question. Marcia, these online sessions are great. Thanks. Would love to see the other. Oh, yes, yeah. So we're doing the webinar style just because it gives us a little bit more control over, who's in the space. We have to like let people into the room so that we don't get Zoom bombed by random people who are not really here for the right reasons. So yeah, we will definitely put this on the web or on YouTube so you can check it out afterwards. And Elena will be sending out some follow-up communications, and Han will be sending out some follow-up communications. And I think lastly, before we wrap up, I just want to say thank you to Elena and Han for being the tech support so that Gladys and I didn't have to toggle between that while we were also trying to talk. It's a little nerve-wracking. So thank you to the two of you. Thank you to our supervisor, Alex, for helping us kind of prepare for our conversation. And personally, I just want to say thank you to Gladys for being such a great partner and, conversational, being such a great conversationalist. So.
Thank you, Gracie. And thank you to everyone who participated today and attended today. We really appreciate you being here and spending some of your summertime with us, and as well as submitting your questions. Again, if you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to us either through email. We also have social media accounts that we highly encourage you to follow that you can find on our website.
Yeah, all of our contact information is on the website, and our pictures are above all of our contact info, so you can easily find us there. Alrighty, everybody, thank you so much. Have a great afternoon, and we will hopefully see you next week for the next session.
Bye.
Take care. Thank you.
Thank you, Patricia.
Thanks, Patty.
Oh, it's Patty?
Yeah, Patty.